My name is Beatrice Washington, and 18 months ago, I thought I'd lost my son to a woman who nearly destroyed our family legacy. Today I want to tell you about the journey that followed. One that would test everything we'd rebuilt and reveal secrets about our home that changed everything we thought we knew about courage, love, and what it truly means to protect what matters most. Please stay with me as I share this next chapter of our story. Your support through likes, shares, and subscriptions means the world to us and helps us continue telling stories that matter. The Sunday evening air in Atlanta was thick with the scent of magnolias and the promise of summer rain. I was in my kitchen, hands deep in cornbread batter, when I heard Marcus's key in the front door. But this time he wasn't alone. "Mama," he called out, his voice carrying that particular note of nervous excitement I remembered from his teenage years. "I brought someone I'd like you to meet." I wiped my hands on my apron and walked to the foyer, where Marcus stood with a woman I'd never seen before. She was petite, with natural hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that held genuine warmth, not the calculated charm I'd learned to recognize and fear. "Mama, this is Keisha Thompson," Marcus said, his hand gently resting on the small of her back. "Keisha, this is my mother, Beatrice Washington." Keisha stepped forward with a smile that reached her eyes. "Mrs. Washington, it's such an honor to meet you. Marcus has told me so much about you and this beautiful house." I felt my chest tighten, not with anger, but with something more complex. Fear, maybe. Or just the memory of standing in this same spot 18 months ago, watching another woman catalog my family's treasures with calculating eyes. "It's nice to meet you too, Keisha," I managed, forcing a smile. "Y'all come on in. Dinner's almost ready." As we walked toward the dining room, I watched Keisha's reaction to our restored family photos lining the hallway. She stopped at a sepia-toned picture of my great-grandmother standing in front of this very house in 1943. "This is incredible," she said softly, studying the photograph. "The architecture, the history. Marcus mentioned your family has lived here for generations." "4 generations," I replied carefully, waiting for the inevitable comment about updating or modernizing. Instead, Keisha nodded with what seemed like genuine respect. "I'm a 3rd-grade teacher at Westside Elementary. We've been doing a unit on local history, and I've been researching some of the older homes in this neighborhood. There's so much story in these walls." Marcus caught my eye and smiled, the first genuinely relaxed smile I'd seen from him in months. "Keisha actually grew up in foster care," he said gently. "She understands what it means when a house becomes home." Something in my chest loosened just a little. Over dinner, I found myself studying Keisha the way I'd once studied Simone. But this time I was looking for authenticity instead of deception. When she asked about my mother's recipe for cornbread, she pulled out her phone not to take a selfie, but to carefully note the ingredients. When Marcus told stories about his childhood in this house, she listened with genuine interest, asking follow-up questions about family traditions rather than changing the subject. "Mrs. Washington," she said as I served peach cobbler, "I hope this isn't too forward, but I've been doing some research on the houses in this area for my students. Would you mind if I asked about your family's history here?" I set down the serving spoon, my guard immediately rising. "What kind of research?" "Local history," she said quickly, sensing my hesitation. "I'm trying to help my students understand how families built communities, how homes became gathering places. Your house has such a presence on the street. I wondered if it had any historical significance." Marcus reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Mama, it's okay. Keisha's not. She's not like before." The reference to Simone hung in the air for a moment, and I saw Keisha's expression shift to one of understanding and respect. "I don't know much about historical significance," I said slowly. "Just that it's been in our family since my great-grandmother's time. She bought it in 1943, right after the war." Keisha nodded thoughtfully. "That's actually a significant time period for this neighborhood. A lot of African American families were establishing roots here, building community. It's part of what makes these houses so special. After dinner, as Marcus helped me clear the table, Keisha asked if she could look at the family photos again. I found her in the living room, standing in front of our restored photo wall, studying each image with the careful attention of someone who understood that pictures held more than just memories. "Your great-grandmother was beautiful," she said, pointing to the 1943 photograph. "She has such strength in her face." "She raised 6 children in this house," I replied, joining her. "Including my grandmother, who raised me and my mother here. 4 generations of strong women," Keisha said softly. "Your son is lucky to have such deep roots." For the first time since Marcus had walked through the door with her, I felt myself truly relax. This wasn't calculation or manipulation. This was respect. As they were leaving, Keisha turned back at the door. "Mrs. Washington, would it be all right if I brought some of my students by some time? They're learning about community history, and seeing a house like this one that's been loved and maintained by the same family for so long, it would mean a lot to them." I looked at Marcus, who was watching me with hopeful eyes, then back at Keisha. "I'd like that," I said, and meant it. After they left, I sat on the front porch with a glass of sweet tea, watching the lightning bugs dance across the yard. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to hope that maybe, just maybe, Marcus had found someone who understood what love really meant. But as I was about to go inside, I noticed Mrs. Dorothy from next door standing at her window, watching my house with an expression I couldn't quite read. She'd moved in about 6 months ago, a widow in her 70s who kept to herself but always seemed to be paying attention to everything happening on our street. When she saw me looking, she gave a small wave and disappeared from the window. Something about it left me unsettled, though I couldn't put my finger on why. The next few weeks brought a routine I hadn't experienced in years. The comfortable rhythm of family dinners where everyone actually wanted to be there. Keisha joined us every Sunday, and gradually, she became part of our conversation, our laughter, our healing. She brought her students by on a Saturday morning in late April, 15 third graders who listened with wide eyes as I told them about growing up in the house, about Sunday dinners and holiday traditions, about the pecan trees their great-great-grandparents had planted. "Mrs. Washington," one little girl asked, "did your house help people during the old days?" I looked at her, confused. "Help people how, sweetheart?" "Like in the Underground Railroad," she said matter-of-factly. "Miss Thompson said some of the houses around here were stopping places for people escaping slavery." I glanced at Keisha, who looked as surprised as I felt. I don't know about that," I said honestly. "No one in my family ever mentioned anything like that." But that night, I couldn't stop thinking about the little girl's question. I called Marcus and asked him to come over the next evening. There was something I wanted to look into. "What are you thinking, Mama?" he asked as we stood in the basement, looking at the stone walls that had always just been part of the house's foundation. "I'm thinking maybe we don't know everything about this house," I said, running my hand along the rough stone. "Look at this wall. Doesn't it seem thicker than it needs to be?" Marcus pulled out his phone's flashlight and examined the wall more closely. "Actually, yeah. And look at this." He pointed to what looked like scratches in the stone, marks that could have been random, or could have been something more deliberate. We spent the next hour examining the basement, and that's when we found it. A section of wall that sounded hollow when we knocked on it. With Marcus's help, I managed to work one of the loose stones free, revealing a small cavity behind it. Inside was a tin box, wrapped in oilcloth and preserved against time and moisture. My hands shook as I opened it, revealing a collection of letters, a small leather journal, and a photograph that made me gasp. It was my great-grandmother, younger than I'd ever seen her, standing with a group of people in front of the house. But these weren't family photos. These were documentation. Names, dates, and the words "Safe Passage, July 1943, written in careful handwriting. "Mama," Marcus whispered, reading over my shoulder. "Do you realize what this means?" I sat down heavily on the basement steps, clutching the journal. "It means this house has been protecting people for a lot longer than we knew." The journal revealed everything. My great-grandmother, Essie Washington, had been part of a network that helped people traveling north during the final years of segregation. The house had served as a stopping point, a place where people could rest, eat, and plan their next steps toward freedom. The hidden compartment had held food, blankets, and documents. The thick basement walls had muffled conversations and hidden evidence of the people who passed through. My great-grandmother had risked everything to help others find their way to safety. "She never told anyone," I said, tears streaming down my face. "She kept this secret her whole life." Marcus sat beside me on the steps. "She was protecting everyone, the people she helped, her family, the house itself. If the wrong people had found out, she could have lost everything," I finished. "But she did it anyway." We spent the rest of the evening reading through the letters and journal entries. Stories of courage, of families separated and reunited, of hope carried through darkness. My great-grandmother's words revealed not just the mechanics of what she'd done, but the heart behind it. "Every person who passes through this house carries a piece of my prayers with them," she'd written. "I cannot give them freedom, but I can give them rest. I cannot change their world, but I can offer them sanctuary. This house will always be a place where love is stronger than fear." When Keisha arrived for Sunday dinner the following week, Marcus and I could barely contain our excitement. We led her to the basement and showed her everything we'd discovered. She stood in stunned silence, examining the letters and photographs. "Mrs. Washington," she finally said, "do you understand what you found? This is living history. This is proof that your family has been protecting and serving this community for generations." "It changes everything," I said softly. "I always knew this house was special because of our family memories. But it's so much more than that." Keisha looked around the basement with new eyes. "We need to document all of this properly. This should be preserved, shared. Your great-grandmother's story needs to be told." Over the following weeks, Keisha helped us catalog everything we'd found. She connected us with local historians, arranged for professional photography of the documents, and helped us understand the full significance of what we'd uncovered. But it was during this process that Mrs. Dorothy knocked on our door one evening, carrying a manila envelope and wearing an expression of nervous determination. "Mrs. Washington," she said, "I think it's time we talked." I invited her in, and she sat primly on the edge of the couch, clutching her envelope. "I knew your great-grandmother," she said without preamble. "I was just a child, but I lived on this street with my aunt. I knew what went on in this house." My heart stopped. "You knew?" Mrs. Dorothy nodded. "My aunt was part of the network. She helped coordinate between the houses, made sure people had what they needed. I was sworn to secrecy, even as a child. Your great-grandmother made me promise I'd never tell anyone what I'd seen." She opened the envelope and pulled out several more photographs. Pictures of my great-grandmother with other women from the neighborhood, pictures of the house with groups of people, pictures that told the story of an entire community working together. "I kept these all these years," she said, "waiting for the right time to share them. When I moved back to this neighborhood and saw you living here, I knew the time was coming. And when I saw you with your son and that young woman, working to preserve your family's legacy, I knew you were ready." Marcus leaned forward. "Mrs. Dorothy, why are you telling us this now?" Her expression grew serious. "Because someone else has been asking questions. Someone who doesn't have good intentions." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "A woman came by last week. Said she was a historical researcher. Wanted to know about the houses on this street. She was particularly interested in this house, asking about property records, improvements, any legal claims that might exist." I already knew, even before she said the name. She said her name was Sandra Mills, but she used to go by something else. She mentioned she'd lived here before. Marcus cursed under his breath. Simone. Mrs. Dorothy nodded grimly. She's been talking to other neighbors, spreading rumors about the house being historically significant but poorly maintained. She's suggesting that someone with proper credentials should be managing its preservation. What kind of credentials? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. She claims to be a historical preservationist now. Says she has legal grounds to petition for conservatorship of historically significant properties that aren't being properly maintained. My worst fears were crystallizing into reality. Simone Sandra had returned, and she'd found a new angle of attack. There's more, Mrs. Dorothy continued. She's been in contact with a development company that specializes in historical properties. They're interested in purchasing houses like this one, claiming they want to preserve them but really planning to gut them and turn them into luxury condos. Marcus stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. She's trying to steal the house again. But this time, she's using its history against us. Can she do that? Yes. Legally, I mean. Mrs. Dorothy's expression was grave. If she can prove the house has historical significance and argue that it's not being properly preserved, she might be able to get a court order. Especially if she has a development company backing her with lawyers and money. I felt the familiar tightness in my chest. The same feeling I'd had when I first realized what Simone was doing to our family 18 months ago. But this time something was different. This time I wasn't facing it alone. What do we do? Marcus asked. Before I could answer, Keisha spoke up. We fight. But we fight smart and we fight together. She stood up, her teacher's authority evident in her voice. Mrs. Washington, you have legal ownership of this property. Mrs. Dorothy, you have documentation and witness testimony about its historical significance. And I have connections in the educational community who would support preserving this house as a legitimate historical site. But Sandra has lawyers and money, I protested. And we have truth, Keisha replied firmly. Your great-grandmother's story, the actual history of this house, the community that still remembers what happened here. That's worth more than any legal maneuvering. Mrs. Dorothy nodded. There are other families on this street whose houses were part of the network. Other people who remember. If we work together, we can protect not just this house, but the whole neighborhood's history, Marcus finished. For the first time since Mrs. Dorothy had knocked on our door, I felt hope instead of fear. What do you need me to do? The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Keisha organized community meetings, bringing together neighbors, historians, and local officials. Mrs. Dorothy connected us with other families who had stories to tell, other houses with secrets to share. We learned that our entire neighborhood had been part of a network that had helped hundreds of people during the 1940s and 50s. The community had worked together then, and they were willing to work together now. But Sandra wasn't sitting idle. She'd filed preliminary paperwork with the county, claiming that the house was a historically significant property in need of professional preservation. She'd also started a whisper campaign, suggesting that I was an elderly woman who couldn't properly maintain such an important piece of history. The first direct confrontation came on a Saturday morning when I was working in the garden. I heard a car door slam and looked up to see Sandra walking up my front path, dressed in a business suit and carrying a briefcase. She looked different, more polished, more professional. But her eyes held the same calculating coldness I remembered. "Hello, Beatrice," she said, as if we were old friends meeting for lunch. "Sandra," I replied, not moving from where I knelt among the tomato plants. "What do you want?" "I want to talk about preserving this house," she said, setting down her briefcase. "I think we both want what's best for this property." I stood up slowly, wiping my hands on my gardening gloves. "I think we have very different ideas about what's best." She gestured toward the house. "This place has incredible historical significance. It deserves to be preserved properly, maintained by professionals who understand its value. I understand its value just fine, I said evenly. I've been living with its history my whole life. Sandra's mask slipped slightly. You've been letting it deteriorate. Look at that front porch. The paint is peeling. The garden is overgrown. This house needs proper investment, proper care. This house needs love, I replied. Not investment. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a folder. I have a proposal. The development company I'm working with is prepared to purchase this property for well above market value. You'd be able to move somewhere more manageable, and the house would be preserved as a historical site. Preserved how? Restored to its original condition, maintained as a museum, open to the public. Its history would be protected forever. I took the folder but didn't open it. And what would your role be in all this? I'd be the historical consultant and property manager. I have the credentials now, the expertise to ensure proper preservation. I handed the folder back to her. No, Beatrice, be reasonable. You're not getting any younger. Marcus has his own life now. What happens to this house when you're gone? It stays in my family, I said firmly. Where it belongs. Sandra's professional facade cracked completely. You're being selfish. This house is bigger than your family. It's part of American history. It's part of my family's history, I corrected. And that's exactly why it's going to stay with my family. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. You can't fight this forever, Beatrice. I have lawyers, I have backing, I have documentation. You have what? An old deed and stubborn pride. I have something you'll never understand, I said, meeting her eyes. I have roots. That evening I called an emergency meeting at the house. Marcus, Keisha, Mrs. Dorothy, and 3 other neighbors gathered in my living room while I told them about Sandra's visit. She's escalating, Marcus said grimly. This isn't just about the house anymore. She's trying to legitimize her claim through historical preservation. But that's actually our strength, Keisha said. The house does have historical significance, and we can prove it better than she can. We have the real documentation, the real stories. Mrs. Dorothy nodded. And we have the community. Every family on this street has a story about what happened here. That's not something you can fake or buy. So what's our next move? Yes. We go public, Keisha said. We tell the real story before she can twist it into something else. The following week, we organized a community heritage event. Keisha arranged for local news coverage, and Mrs. Dorothy helped coordinate with other families to share their stories. We opened the house to neighbors, historians, and anyone who wanted to learn about the real history of our neighborhood. The response was overwhelming. People came from across the city to hear about the underground network that had operated here, to see the hidden compartment, to touch the walls that had sheltered so many seeking freedom. But the most powerful moment came when Mrs. Dorothy stood in my living room, surrounded by 3 generations of neighbors, and told the story of the first time she'd seen my great-grandmother. I was 7 years old, she said, her voice carrying across the hushed room. My aunt brought me here in the middle of the night. There was a thunderstorm and we were soaked through. Miss Essie opened that front door and the first thing she said was, "Come on in, babies. You're safe now." She looked around the room, making eye contact with each person present. That's what this house has always been, a place where people are safe. Miss Essie understood that home isn't just about who lives there. It's about who's welcomed there. After most of the crowd had left, I found myself standing in the kitchen with Marcus, Keisha, and Mrs. Dorothy, surrounded by the comfortable mess of a successful gathering. "You did good today, Mama," Marcus said, helping me stack plates. "Grandma Essie would be proud." "She would," Mrs. Dorothy agreed. "You're carrying on her legacy in the best possible way." Keisha was at the sink, washing dishes, when she suddenly went still. "Mrs. Washington," she said quietly, "there's a car outside. Someone's been sitting there for about 10 minutes. I looked out the window and saw a black sedan parked across the street. As we watched, Sandra got out and walked toward the house. "She's got nerve," Marcus muttered. "She's got desperation," I corrected. "And that makes her dangerous." Sandra didn't knock. She stood on the front porch and called out, "Beatrice, we need to talk." I opened the door but didn't invite her in. "I think we've said everything we need to say. You think you've won." Sandra's professional composure was completely gone now. "You think this little neighborhood show changes anything?" "I think the truth matters," I replied calmly. "The truth?" Sandra laughed bitterly. "The truth is that you're a selfish old woman who's hoarding a piece of history that belongs to everyone. The truth is that Marcus will never be able to afford maintaining this place properly. The truth is that when you're gone, this house will fall apart anyway." Marcus stepped up behind me. "The truth is that you're a fraud who's been exposed." Again. Sandra's eyes flashed. "You don't know anything about me now. I've built credentials. I've established legitimacy. I have backing from people who understand the real value of historical preservation. You have backing from people who want to tear down this house and build condos," Keisha said, joining us at the door. "We've done our research too, Sandra. We know exactly what kind of development company you're working with." For a moment, Sandra looked genuinely surprised. Then her expression hardened. "You can't stop this. I've already filed the paperwork. The county is going to investigate whether this property is being adequately maintained as a historical site." "Good," I said. "I welcome that investigation." Sandra blinked. "What?" I said I welcome it. Come look at our documentation. Interview our neighbors. Review our maintenance records. Learn about the real history of this house. "But," Sandra seemed thrown off balance. "You can't possibly meet the standards for historical preservation. You don't have professional credentials." "I have something better," I said. "I have love, have family, I have community, and I have the truth." Sandra stared at me for a long moment, then turned and walked back to her car. But I could see from her posture that this wasn't over. The county investigation began 2 weeks later. An inspector came to examine the house, its condition, and our documentation of its historical significance. We were ready. Keisha had helped us organize everything. The letters, photographs, and journal entries were professionally preserved and documented. Mrs. Dorothy provided sworn testimony about the house's role in the underground network. Other neighbors shared their families' stories. Most importantly, we had evidence of ongoing maintenance and preservation. Every repair, every careful restoration, every effort to maintain the house's historical integrity while keeping it a living home was documented. The inspector, a middle-aged woman named Dr. Janet Foster, spent hours examining the house, the basement, and our documentation. She interviewed Mrs. Dorothy, spoke with neighbors, and reviewed our preservation efforts. "Mrs. Washington," she said as she prepared to leave, "I have to say, this is one of the most well-documented and carefully maintained historical properties I've encountered. You clearly understand the significance of what you're preserving." "I understand that this house has always been about more than just my family," I replied. "But it's also about honoring the people who made it special." Dr. Foster smiled. "I'll be recommending that this property be officially designated as a local historical landmark. With your permission, of course." "What would that mean?" "It would mean legal protection from inappropriate development, potential funding for preservation efforts, and official recognition of your family's stewardship of this important piece of history." I looked at Marcus and Keisha, who were both grinning. "I think that sounds perfect." But Sandra wasn't finished. When the county's decision came down, officially designating the house as a historical landmark with the Washington family as its recognized stewards, she filed an appeal. Her lawyers argued that the county had been influenced by emotional manipulation rather than professional standards. They claimed that proper historical preservation required removing the property from private ownership and placing it under professional management. The appeal hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late October. I woke up that day feeling like I was preparing for battle. "You ready for this, Mama?" Marcus asked as we walked up the courthouse steps. "I've been ready for this my whole life," I replied. "I just didn't know it." The courtroom was packed. Sandra sat at one table with two expensive-looking lawyers. I sat at another table with my attorney, a sharp young woman named Patricia Collins who specialized in property law and historical preservation. But the most important people in the room weren't at the legal tables. They were in the gallery: Mrs. Dorothy, Keisha, neighbors from our street, members of the Historical Society, and dozens of other people who had come to support preserving the house's legacy. Sandra's lawyers spoke first, arguing that historical properties required professional management and that private ownership was inadequate for proper preservation. Mrs. Washington, while well-intentioned, lacks the expertise and resources necessary to maintain this property according to professional standards, one lawyer argued. The house deserves better stewardship than sentimental attachment can provide. When it was our turn, Patricia Collins presented our case methodically. She showed documentation of the house's condition, evidence of our preservation efforts, and testimony from Dr. Foster about the quality of our stewardship. But the turning point came when she called Mrs. Dorothy to testify. Mrs. Dorothy walked slowly to the witness stand, but her voice was strong and clear as she told the story of the house's real history. She described the underground network, the courage of my great-grandmother, and the community that had protected these secrets for decades. "Your Honor," she said, "this house has been preserved not just as a building, but as a living piece of history. The Washington family hasn't just maintained its walls and roof, they've maintained its soul." Then Patricia called me to the stand. I walked up there feeling every one of my 58 years, but also feeling the strength of 4 generations of Washington women who had stood up for what mattered. "Mrs. Washington," Patricia said, "why is it important that this house remain in your family?" I looked out at the courtroom, at Sandra's angry face, at Marcus's encouraging smile, at Keisha's proud expression. "Because," I said, "this house was built on love. My great-grandmother filled it with love when she opened it to people who needed safety. My grandmother filled it with love when she raised her family here. My mother filled it with love when she preserved every recipe and every story. And I've filled it with love by making sure those stories continue." Paused, gathering my thoughts. A house isn't just walls and floors and a roof. It's the life that happens inside it. It's the love that's shared within its walls. You can't preserve that with professional management or development companies. You can only preserve it with family, with continuity, with people who understand that they're not just maintaining a building, they're maintaining a legacy. The judge, an elderly black woman named Judge Williams, listened carefully to all the testimony. When both sides had finished, she asked for a brief recess to consider her decision. We waited in the hallway, surrounded by our supporters. Sandra and her lawyers huddled separately, their confidence noticeably shaken. When we reconvened, Judge Williams spoke slowly and deliberately. "I've reviewed all the evidence presented in this case," she said. "I've considered the arguments about professional preservation standards and the importance of maintaining historical properties." My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear her words. "But I've also considered the testimony about this house's real history, and the evidence of the Washington family's stewardship over 4 generations." She looked directly at me. "Mrs. Washington, your family has not only preserved this house, you've preserved its purpose. You've maintained it as a place where people are welcomed, where stories are shared, where love is stronger than fear." She turned to Sandra's legal team. Professional credentials and development backing cannot replace the kind of authentic preservation that comes from genuine connection to a place and its history. Judge Williams picked up her gavel. The appeal is denied. The Washington family will continue as the recognized stewards of this historical landmark. The courtroom erupted in applause. Marcus hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. Keisha was crying. Mrs. Dorothy was clapping with tears streaming down her face. But when I looked toward Sandra's table, she was gone. Her lawyers were packing up their papers, but she had slipped out during the celebration. I never saw her again. 6 months later, on a warm spring evening, I stood in my backyard watching Marcus and Keisha exchange vows under the pecan trees my great-great-grandmother had planted. The house was decorated with flowers from the garden, and every seat was filled with family and friends who had supported us through everything. As they kissed to seal their marriage, I thought about all the love that had been shared within these walls, all the courage that had been displayed, all the families that had been protected and welcomed. Mrs. Dorothy caught my eye from across the yard and smiled. She was wearing my mother's pearl necklace, something I'd given her as a thank you for preserving our family's history. After the ceremony, as guests mingled and celebrated, Keisha found me on the front porch. "Mrs. Washington," she said, "I have something to ask you." I looked at her expectantly. "Marcus and I have been talking, and we want to know if you'd consider making this house a community heritage center. Not taking it away from the family, but opening it regularly for educational programs, neighborhood events, celebrations of local history." Smiled. "I think that's exactly what Grandma Essie would want." Really. This house has always been about more than just our family. It's about community, about welcome, about being a place where people can find safety and belonging. Keisha hugged me tightly. "Thank you for trusting me with your family's legacy. Thank you for helping me understand that legacy is something you share, not something you hoard." As the evening wound down and the last guests departed, I found myself alone on the front porch with a cup of tea, looking out over the street where my great-grandmother had once watched for travelers who needed shelter. The house behind me was quiet but not empty. It was full of love, full of history, full of the promise of future generations who would continue to fill it with life and meaning. Marcus came out and sat beside me. "Mama, are you happy?" I looked at him. My son, now a husband, someday maybe a father who would bring his own children to this house for Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations. "I'm peaceful," I said. "For the first time in years, I'm completely peaceful." He nodded, understanding. "The house is safe. The house is loved," I corrected. "And as long as it's loved, it will always be safe." A year later, we officially opened the Washington Family Heritage Center. Every Saturday, we welcome visitors who want to learn about the underground network that operated in our neighborhood, about the courage of ordinary people who did extraordinary things, about the families who built communities one act of love at a time. Keisha teaches workshops for children about local history. Mrs. Dorothy gives tours and shares stories. Marcus manages the administrative side, ensuring that the house's dual purpose as family home and community center works for everyone. And me. I make sure there's always sweet tea in the kitchen, always a welcoming smile at the door, always a place where people can sit and feel the love that has filled these walls for generations. The house that love built is still standing strong. And it always will be, because now I understand what my great-grandmother knew all along. The most powerful way to preserve something precious is to share it with people who need it most. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that love and community are stronger than greed and manipulation, please let us know in the comments. Share your own stories about family legacy, about standing up for what matters, about the difference between a house and a home. And if you believe in the power of authentic love to overcome any challenge, please like this video and subscribe for more stories about courage, family, and the unbreakable bonds that hold us together. Thank you for joining us for this journey. Remember, a house may have walls, but it's the love inside those walls that makes it a home worth fighting for. If you find this story interesting, kindly subscribe and share for more.